We are still in, and we're going to be for some time, in the sixth Mishnah of the sixth chapter, the 48 different aspects and facets of what it is to acquire Torah. To acquire Torah. Now, we said we're going to be doing this in clusters because there's so many facts that we have to divide them into clusters. And we did not get to fully complete the previous clusters, which means that even before we get into today's, we have to revisit some of last time, which was about the second segment of the cluster was about characteristics that a person has to adopt in order to be in a position that they could receive the Torah, that they could genuinely understand the Torah. And so we spoke about, where we're picking up today, Ema, Yira, we spoke about that, fear and awe. And then Anava, Simcha, Tahara, that we haven't fully completed. Anava is humility, Simcha is joy, and Tahara is purity. So that's what we have to start with today, and then we can hopefully look at the next cluster, which are techniques that a person needs to use in order to be able to gain Torah. And the first set of techniques, the first cluster of techniques that we're going to look at is positive things we should be doing in order to engage with Torah. So we did touch on the idea of anava, of humility, and of course the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu is the ultimate conduit of the Torah and is the most humble person. We just read it in Shul this past Shabbos, that Moshe was the most humble person ever in history. And so it's no surprise then that he is the perfect candidate to transmit the Torah to us. But let's drill down into that a little bit. I had a very, very interesting experience towards the end of last week because the parasha is about Moshe and about humility. So I figured, as I like to do from time to time, is just get a sense of what people think about certain traits or about certain attitudes or about certain beliefs in Judaism. So I posted a question on social media. How do you know if somebody is genuinely humble? The responses were fascinating, really fascinating, and many, many, many responses. Needless to say, of course, there were those people who said, I'm an example, right? They were more tongue-in-cheek. If you want to know what humility is, look at me. It reminded me a little bit of the story where they used to have in some of the shuls back in the old days, they used to honor people by being called to the Torah for an aliyah. And depending on who you were, determined which aliyah you got. So let's say the wealthiest person in the shul would get a particular aliyah, and the greatest scholar in the shul would get a particular aliyah. So in this one particular shul, and by the way, this is not a joke, this is a true story. In this one particular shul, they used to reserve one of the aliyahs for the most humble person in the shul. So you got called up if you were the most humble person in the shul. Okay? So one day, somebody went to complain to the Gabbai that he hasn't had the aliyah. He has been called up as the most humble person in Shul. So what was interesting about people's responses to how do you know if somebody is genuinely humble was that quite a number of people could not seem to distinguish between humility and lack of self-esteem. And people believed that a lack of self-esteem is actually a positive thing. So for example, one of the people said, that if somebody offers you a compliment and you have difficulty accepting the compliment, that's a sign that you're humble, which is not the case. That is not a sign of humility. That is a sign of a person who's not comfortable in their own skin. So it's quite important for us to understand what is anava. What is this humility? If we're saying that humility is one of the key gateways to be able to receive and to be able to understand Torah, then we have to know, so what is humility? What is humility? How do you define humility? Needless to say, there were a number of people who responded to my question by saying, only Hashem knows. Only Hashem knows what is truly in another person's heart, which is fair on the one hand, but I don't think it's good enough. It's a bit of a cop-out on the other hand, because we need to be able to have role models in our lives. And if we're expected to be humble people, then surely there's somebody we should be able to look at and say, this is what it means to be humble. And the Torah would not tell us that Moshe was the most humble person on earth if it weren't something that we could learn from. So it's a really important question for us to analyze. What does it mean to be humble? Because in order to learn Torah, we have to be humble. In fact, I'll tell you an interesting thing. The Gemara says, there's a piece of Gemara in Sota that goes through a whole list and litany of the things that go wrong when a person is arrogant, which of course is the exact opposite of humility. One of the things that the Gemara there says is that a person who is arrogant will become poor. Now you've got to wonder, what's the association between poverty and arrogance? So there's another Gemara, not in that same section, there's a different Gemara that says, Ein ani ela b'da'as. that the only true poverty is the poverty of knowledge. So the implication, therefore, is that if a person is arrogant, they don't have access to the Torah, and therefore they become poor, impoverished in their thinking, in their wisdom, in their understanding. So clearly, in order for a person to access Torah, we have to have humility. We saw this right from the very first Mishnah of the whole of Pirkei Avos. Because the very first Mishnah said, Moshe kibel Torah. Moshe received the Torah. It doesn't say Moshe was the outstanding scholar. Moshe mastered the Torah. Moshe taught the Torah. We say kibel, that's quite a passive position. And that implies humility, that he was humble enough to receive the Torah rather than, as unfortunately happens sometimes, to try and master the Torah according to a person's particular bias or their particular outlook. So what is anava? And seeing as Moshe is the paragon of humility, it's probably a good place to start. So how did Moshe walk around all day? Did Moshe walk around shuffling his feet, looking at the ground, not making eye contact, shying away from public appearances? Definitely not. Moshe was anything but. Moshe was very confident, not only confident in his role, but confident in his position. That's one of the big things we're going to read about, not this Shabbos, but next Shabbos with Korach. That when Korach challenges Moshe's position, Moshe has no problem saying, all right, let's see if Hashem will tell us who's right. He's not afraid of saying, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I have the wrong position. He puts Korach in his place quite strongly. So it's evident that humility is not that a person slinks into the shadows. Humility can go very comfortably with confidence, leadership, a teaching role, influence, assertiveness. So what is humility? And when we say that Moshe was the most humble person who ever lived, it is interesting how the Torah says it. What does the Torah say? V'ha'ish Moshe anav. Moshe was humble. Mikol ha'adam asher al pnei ha'adama. That's difficult to translate. So people typically translate it more than anybody else on earth. More than anybody else on earth. But that's not really a good translation because mikol doesn't mean then, it means from. He was humble from every person on earth. And you could say that maybe is just the technicality of the grammar in Hebrew versus how we say it in English, but the Torah is very specific. So when it says mi kol ha'adam, more than any person on earth, but says it as from every person on earth, that is obviously significant.
But how would you say
then? You would also say me, but you could say me. You're right. The word is maybe equally used in both contexts, but the more natural translation of mikol is from, and we have to analyze why that is. I'll tell you another interesting, and this is also a true story. True story. So there was an individual who was a student of the Baal Shem Tov, and he had a very, very good friend. The two of them had studied in yeshiva together, and the friend was an absolute genius. He was also a little bit of a hermit, but he was an absolute genius. And this particular individual who had become a student of the Baal Shem Tov wanted to introduce his friend to the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. But the friend was very, very engrossed in his particular avodah, in his way of serving Hashem, which, as you're about to discover, was quite extreme. And it wasn't so easy for his friend, the chassid, to get in with him. So on one particular occasion, it was a whole long story until eventually they actually were able to open dialogue. Eventually, when they opened the dialogue, the friend at some point admitted the following. So he had a very, very intense schedule. He pretty much stayed in the shul 24/7. He never looked beyond the walls of the shul. If he had to walk in the street, he'd always keep his eyes down so that he never made eye contact with anybody. God forbid he should see anything which was inappropriate. He's a very holy man. And yet, one day when they were in the course of their very open and honest conversations, he made the following confession. He says he was once called up to the Torah. And it was Parashas Ba'al Loischa that we've just read. And it was the story of Ha'ish Moshe Anav Mikol Adam Asher Al Pnei Ha'adama. It says that Moshe was the most humble person of all people on earth, and he was disturbed. There he was, getting this aliyah, reading this Torah, and he said, how could it be that the Torah says that Moshe was the most humble person who ever lived on the face of the earth, when the fact is we all know how great Moshe was? You know how great, we know how, everybody knows how great Moshe is. Me, on the other hand, nobody knows about what I do. This was a person who was completely absolutely fluent in the Gemara, in the Shulchan Aruch, in the books of Kabbalah. He was a person who was an incredible Torah scholar. He had worked very hard on his own personal development. And he said to himself, he says, even my wife doesn't understand my own greatness. So how could it therefore say that Moshe is the most humble person on earth if he is a public figure, whereas nobody knows me? And maybe that's greater humility. And he said, he eventually came to the conclusion that that's why the Torah says, more so than any person who was on earth, because there's another deeper degree of humility, and that is somebody who is more humble even than those who are in heaven. And that's how he placated himself, that he's this incredible scholar and this person who is totally dedicated to Hashem, and yet his humility could potentially be even greater than Moshe. So he's having this conversation with his friend the Chassid, and in the course of their conversation, as they had learned the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, he came to realize what a misguided position that was. To suggest that he might be more humble than Moshe. And he said, because obviously we don't understand what humility is. So what is humility, and what is the humility of Moshe, and why is the humility of Moshe associated specifically with Mikola Adam, from other people on earth? Let's just add one other layer to this. Two other layers. And we've touched on one of these before, and that is the principle that if a person denies their talents, that is not humility, that is falsehood. So for example, if somebody comes over to you and says, I love the way that you conduct yourself with your kids. You're a model parent. And you say to them, no, not me. If you only knew what went on behind closed doors, you wouldn't say that about me. So either that is a little bit of a reality check, or it's just false. That what we're doing is we're so uncomfortable with the possibility of somebody giving us a compliment that we fabricate something that's actually not true because we don't want to confront our reality. That is not humility. Equally, there's another consideration. If a person downplays their abilities, that precludes them doing what Hashem wants. Because Hashem is the one who gave us these abilities, and obviously therefore intends for us to use them to the very best potential that they have. So if we downplay our abilities, we'd be, quote unquote, robbing Hashem of his investment in us. So it's not so simple. A person can't just turn around and say, no, me, what, who, me? Now, of course, we know that that's a very Jewish thing to do, particularly in the frum world. So people say, would you like to speak? Would you like to teach? Would you like to daven? No, not me, ask somebody else. And in the meantime, we're all hoping that maybe they will actually persist. Maybe they'll convince me. So at the end of the day, if a person is humble, that we have to be humble enough to recognize that if Hashem has given us particular abilities, we have to use them. That actually is humility. And that's Moshe's starting point. Moshe's starting point is humility is not to deny our talents, rather to appreciate where they come from. Because it's a terrible mistake to believe that we are talented because we made ourselves to be talented. We have to recognize at the end of the day, Hashem endowed this person with this talent and that person with that talent. So it's not about me. It's what Hashem gave me. That is the root of humility. It's to acknowledge that the values, the talents, the assets, the insights, the wisdom, the charisma, whatever it is, that is Hashem's gift to us.
So what was amazing about Moshe is that he didn't even use what was his talent. He couldn't speak. So that wasn't his talent, and still had the humility to do what Hashem asked.
Okay, that's an interesting point. So you're saying Moshe had an area of his life that he wasn't gifted in, the area of speech, and yet his whole career was about speech. So that means that he was willing to push himself to do something that was even beyond his talent set, which is a really good point. That's a really good point. I want to just flip that for 1 second and just suggest the possibility that the inability to speak could also be a sense of being humble. Like, who am I to speak? So it's just important to, I'm not disagreeing, just adding another layer to it. So the starting position of Moshe is, Anova means that the gifts that I have are exactly that, they're gifts. It's not something to pat myself on the back for. So for example, if a person is incredibly smart, and as a result of that, they always get top marks in class, or they understand things, the first thing that they're being explained, they look around at everybody else, why are you asking questions? That was so straightforward. That's not a reason to be smug. That's a reason to be incredibly humble. My gosh, look, when I see how other people are and that it takes them a little bit longer to understand, then I need to be grateful to Hashem for the incredible gift that He's given me, that I can actually understand things quickly. Or if We have, thank God, good children. You know, yes, of course, we invest in our children, but it's a gift. The fact of the matter is, you can do the best, and you can have the greatest people in the world investing in their children. It doesn't always necessarily work out. So it's a gift. It's not something to walk around and say, I'm now the big parenting expert, and I'm going to write a book and do a seminar. I'm not saying you shouldn't write a book and do a seminar, but it needs to come from a perspective which is humility. It's a gift. Baruch Hashem. Baruch Hashem, this is what I have. Moshe takes it one step further. We have to understand what kind of gifts Moshe has. And this is the big issue. We completely misunderstand or underestimate Moshe. And don't worry, we're not the only ones. His own sister underestimated him, as you would have discovered in the parasha this week. Right? In fact, just for half a second, I want to create a little bit of context about that particular story because it's going to be relevant to our conversation about humility. And then hopefully we can extract something out of that to apply to our own humility. Let's just pause for one moment. I don't know about you. I don't know what the community is like in the particular shul that you belong to. But I heard that there are some communities where people have criticisms of their leaders. No, you never heard about this. Okay, fine. So just, you'll have to trust me that this actually happens. People who are critical of their leaders. There's some communities. I don't think it's here. It's in other parts of the world. And so it's not. It wouldn't be surprising if there were people in the Jewish world who were critical of Moshe's behavior. In fact, we saw that. So that with Korach is a great example. And the likelihood is there were other examples. In fact, we also know that when Aaron passed away, we're told that the whole Jewish community mourned. And the implication was that not everybody mourned Moshe Rabbeinu. Just pause and think about that for a second. So this is the nation who were taken out of Egypt by Moshe. They got the Torah through Moshe. He split the sea for them. He provided them with a man every single day. And all that. And at the end, not everybody was happy with him. This is life. So that wouldn't have surprised us too much if there were people, agitators within the community who had the criticisms of Moshe. What's fascinating about the story is that it's Miriam, his sister, who has a criticism. And if you consider who Miriam is, number one, you consider who she spoke to, Aaron, number two. You consider the response from Hashem, which is a very harsh response. Number three, you realize that Moshe is obviously a very unique human being. Because let's think about it for 1 second. If you were writing the CV of Aaron, what would you say are his biggest assets? His what? His people skills, right? Peace. He is the peace broker in the Jewish world, right? He's the person who sorts out faribbles. He's the person who brings couples back together again. Incredible. Is that Aaron's greatest asset? I mean, I think it's very important and a very big part of his life. But is that, if you were to write the CV of Aaron HaKohen, I just gave you a clue, right? So what would you say? He is the Kohen Gadol. He is the original high priest. And the goal of the high priest is to be somebody who is entitled to enter into the holiest space in communion with Hashem, albeit once a year, but he's the person who's entitled to do that. So Kohen Gadol is a very advanced spiritual person, and out of all of the Kohanim Gedolim, all of the high priests throughout the whole of history, he is the ultimate high priest. So if you were writing his CV, you'd have to say people skills, absolute 10 out of 10, and spiritual skills, 10 out of 10. So he's a really, really great human being. I promise you, if Aaron had to walk into our world today, we'd be chalishing. We'd be completely blown away by the intensity of his spirituality, by how connected to Hashem he is. We would never have experienced such a person in our lives, ever.
Yet he was quite happy for his younger brother to lead the people out.
Fine. So that's part of his greatness. That's part of his greatness. But that's not his asset. We don't identify Aaron as the symbol of humility. We identify Aaron as the symbol of holiness. Okay? Now, everybody knows, I'm sure you'll agree, that we're a little bit of a patriarchal society, so everybody knows about Aaron, everybody knows about Moshe. So that's why I'm so intrigued to ask you, if you were writing Miriam's CV, what would you say? What's Miriam's biggest contribution to the Jewish world?
She brought the water.
The water, right? The water. What else?
And the singing.
And the singing, yes. And what else? She was a midwife. She was a prophetess. So far, you haven't told me anything about her that makes her so incredibly unique. Oh, this is the thing. This is the thing about Miriam, and it gets completely overlooked. In a nutshell, if not for Miriam, none of us would be here. That's a fact. Let's just analyze this for a second. How many Jews left Egypt? So we know that there were 600,000 men between the ages of 20 and 60. So if you add the men under the age of 20, you add the women, and for the purposes of our conversation, you add the men between the ages of 60 and 80, you probably get somewhere between 2.5 and 3 million people. Okay? Not one of those people would have been alive if not for Miriam. Not one. Because 80 odd years earlier, when Pharaoh made his decree about drowning the Jewish boys, Amram, that's Miriam, Aaron, and eventually Moshe's father, divorces his wife Yocheved because he says, what's the point of having children if Pharaoh is just going to kill them? And because he was seen as the spiritual leader of the community, every other Jew also divorced. Now, if that had continued uninterrupted, none of us would be here. Simple.
She's the mother of the nation.
So she is the mother of the whole Jewish people until the end of time, because she goes to her father and says, what you have done is worse than Paroi, for a variety of reasons. Number one, he's a wicked person, so maybe his words will not be fulfilled. You're a tzaddik, your words will definitely be fulfilled. Number two, he only makes a decree against boys. Your decree affects the girls as well, because girls won't be born either. Number three, his decree only affects physical life. You're preventing people from having an opportunity to go into the next world. And she convinces him to remarry Yocheved. And as a direct result of that, the whole nation remarries. So any person who is under the age of 80 years old at the time the Jews leave Egypt, which I think would be 98% of the population, are all 100% thanks to Miriam. And nobody ever talks about this. She is the individual who literally not saved, but created the Jewish people. Now we know, the Gemara tells us, that a person who saves a single life is considered as if they've saved the entire world. Now imagine what kind of merit, what kind of greatness Miriam has. Imagine what kind of level spiritually Miriam is at. Yet, when she criticizes Moshe, and to contextualize it, her criticism is not malicious, her criticism is not out of place, it's factual. If you remember that Miriam is the person who fought tooth and nail to bring Jewish families together, and therefore the one thing that offends her more than anything else is the separation of a couple, and she hears that her brother has separated from his wife. This is Miriam's life purpose that's being challenged at this point in time. It's not only not surprising that she spoke up against Moshe, it's surprising that anybody has an issue with it. And what's Hashem's response to Miriam? You don't understand who Moshe is. You don't understand. Loi chein avdi Moshe. My servant Moshe is not like any prophet that you're familiar with. You are all prophets. You're not just prophets. You are the greatest people on earth. Aaron and Miriam, the ultimate Kohen Gadol on the one hand, the mother of the entire Jewish nation on the other hand, and yet you don't begin to understand who Moshe is. No, and we do. And we think we know who Moshe is. If Hashem gives such a harsh response to the greatest people who are at such an elevated level that we can't begin to appreciate their greatness, then we certainly don't even begin to have an inkling who Moshe is. So when we say Moshe is Anav Mikola Adam Asher Apnei Ha'adama, that Moshe was the most humble person, the first thing we have to know is how great he was to appreciate his humility. So what's Moshe's attitude? He says 100%, I am the greatest person on earth. Moshe says that. He says, I'm the greatest person on earth. And it has nothing to do with me. I contributed 0 to become the greatest person on earth. That was completely Hashem's idea. It's completely Hashem's doing. He endowed me with these abilities. And that's why you'll notice that earlier on, when the Jewish people complained to Moshe and to Aaron, Moshe responds on behalf of his brother and himself, and he says, V'nachnu ma ki salinu oleinu. What are we that you're complaining to us? We're nothing. We didn't choose this position. We didn't pick these talents. We are purely just representatives of Hashem. Or as we like to say, Shechina medaberes mitoich groino shel Moshe, that the divine presence vocalizes through Moshe's throat. There is no Moshe in the story. There's Hashem. I happen to be the glove that his hand is in. Moshe says to humself, Mikola Adam. I'm now thinking about every other human being on the planet. What happens if Hashem had given them the gift that he gave me? Maybe they would have done a better job. Maybe they, with my assets, would have achieved differently. Maybe under them, the Jews wouldn't have complained about the food or the water or the fact that they're standing on the edge of the sea and are there no graves left in Egypt, or the fact that maybe they fell for the spies or that they participated in a Korach rebellion. So Moshe consistently says, the greatness I have is immaterial. It's a question of the impact. Maybe somebody else with the same tools would have outdone me. Therefore, Moshe looks at every single person, all the 3 million of the Jews in the desert, and says, you are probably greater than I am. Because if you had what I had, you'd probably do a better job. That's not a denial of his abilities. It's not a misuse or lack of use of his abilities, but it is 100% appreciating the value that lies within every single person. What do we say you need in order to learn Torah? Humility. What does humility mean? Humility is not to say, I didn't really understand the Torah, or I didn't. Humility is to say, I accept that the Torah is nothing to do with me. It's not my wisdom. It's not my greatness. If I learn something from Torah, I have to share it as Torah, not as me. Hey, look, join my course. Follow my Instagram, because I've got all this wisdom to share. Rather, it's to recognize this is Hashem's wisdom. I'm fortunate that Hashem gave me the intellect that I can understand this wisdom. But every other person that I engage with, every other person in the shir, every other person in my shul, every other person who I know, potentially, given the identical assets that I have, and of course everybody is different, would be doing a better job than me. So therefore, who am I to lay claim to some kind of greatness because I've learned Torah? That's anova. That is humility, which is the key to Torah. The humility to acknowledge what our abilities are and never to allow that to become a reason to feel in any way better than the next person. To the contrary, to believe that the next person could use those same assets better than us. And effectively, that leaves us, having to work harder. Straight after anova, the next thing he tells us is besimcha. That in order for a person to learn Torah, a person has to have joy. Interesting. What's the link between joy and Torah? Well, unfortunately, the word simcha is very often misunderstood. So if we don't understand the word simcha, it's difficult to understand how the word simcha would apply to Torah learning. What does David HaMelech say? I have joy in your words. What do we talk about? We talk about the fact that Torah is mesamachas es alev. Torah makes a person have simcha. Problem is we don't necessarily know what we mean when we say simcha. Now, first of all, very often when people say simcha, and we've discussed this before as well, very often when people discuss a simcha or use the word simcha, they're referring to something that is an occasion. There's an occasion, simcha. Very often when people hear the word simcha, they anticipate that it's something which you express openly and outwardly. So if you're not singing and dancing when you're learning Torah, apparently you don't have simcha. What is that? Okay, so we have to reconstitute the class completely. Everybody's got to come in, you've got to have a big smile on your face. You've got to be literally, on the edge of your seat with tremendous simcha, because that's what simcha is, right? So what is simcha? And why is it a direct follow-on from anova, from humility?
It's faith in the way.
Exactly. A big chunk of simcha is faith, and a big chunk of faith is humility. One of the greatest reasons people don't have simcha is self. Right?
Also, singing and dancing doesn't mean you have simcha.
That's right, exactly. Singing and dancing does not necessarily guarantee simcha, although sometimes it does help. Sometimes we can modify our moods by mechanically doing things. Right? The principle says, the Sefer HaChinuch tells us that the activities that a person does will influence the way that a person feels. So there's no question that it could help. But it's not an indicator. When you see somebody singing and dancing, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are besimcha. It could also mean that they're standing on hot coals. Right? Or they're desperately waiting for somebody to come out of the bathroom. And there are other reasons people sing and dance. So
To have such belief in Hashem that whatever we're going through is for our good. And therefore, even if it's challenging, we have that optimism to know that we will handle this with Hashem's help.
Absolutely. So Simcha is very much the recognition that what's going on in my life right now is coming directly from Hashem. It's an interesting thing. You remember in the 5th chapter, we learnt about all the lists, the number lists. And one of the number lists that we learnt was that the Jewish people tested Hashem 10 times in the desert. Remember that? Which happens to be in this week's parasha that we're going to be learning this week. This is the pasuk that says, "Vayinasu oisi ze eseh pa'amim," that they tested me 10 times. Now, needless to say, as is to be expected in the Jewish world, there are different opinions about what the 10 times were. There's one list in the Gemara, there's another list in Avos Rabbi Nassan, there's a list in the Rambam. What's interesting is how Rashi explains what the 10 are. Rashi does something very unusual. He quotes 6, and then he says, and you can find the rest in the Gemara. It's unusual, right? Normally you just say, look in the Gemara. Rashi's job is not to give us every single detail about history. Rashi's job is to explain to us what the Torah is saying in that particular case. So it's really strange that he should give the majority of the list and then say, read up the rest in the Gemara. It's a strange way of doing it. When you have a look at the list that Rashi gives us, what you will see, I'm just going to use one of the examples. What he puts on the list is specific examples that illustrate the difference between testing Hashem, rebelling against Hashem, or lacking faith in Hashem, because they're not identical. We tend to mash these things up, so it's all the same thing. It's not. So a transgression is where Hashem says do X and we choose not to do it, or Hashem says don't do X and we choose to do it. That's a transgression. Lack of faith is when we have a wobble. For example, the Jewish people come to the edge of the sea. They don't know where they're supposed to go. There's a sea in front of them. Unfortunately, in Egypt, nobody could afford swimming lessons. So they can't go forward. They can't go backwards because the Egyptians are behind them. So they have a faith wobble. That's not necessarily a test of Hashem, although that is on the list. That is considered one of the 10 tests. But it's not one of the ones that Rashi lists. Rashi gives us an example, the man. They tested Hashem twice with the man. Does anybody know what the 2 tests with regards to the man were?
They lived over.
Good. So the first one is that Hashem said, don't keep any food for tomorrow. And some of them kept leftovers for the next day. So they tested Hashem. Correct. And the second one is Hashem said there'll be no man on Shabbos. And some people went out on Shabbos morning just to check in case maybe there really was going to be man. So what's unique about both of those things is that they had a miracle happen to them. And while the miracle is happening to them, they're testing Hashem about how the miracle works. Right? So Hashem's giving them miraculous food called the man. I don't know, to me it makes perfect sense that if Hashem is doing something miraculous for you, and then he tells you how the miracle is going to work, obviously that's how it's going to work. So he says, this is the miracle, you're going to get this food, and there will be no leftovers, it's not going to last till tomorrow. What are you thinking to keep some food till tomorrow? That's called testing Hashem. So the definition of testing Hashem is when we see Hashem's bracha in our lives, and yet we still feel uncomfortable. We still worry. Right, like the pasuk says, by boiker yoimar mi yiten erev, or by erev yoimar mi yiten boiker. That one of the curses is when a person has, the Gemara tells us, bread on the table for breakfast, but they're anxious because they don't know what they're going to have for supper. And then they have food on the table for supper, but they're anxious that they won't know what to have for breakfast. That is the opposite of simcha. So you can see that there's a direct correlation between simcha and faith, and the opposite of that is lack of faith, or even worse, testing Hashem while the brachas are flowing. So if a person is going to learn Torah, the person has to learn Torah from a position of simcha, which doesn't just simply mean that I trust Hashem and that I have faith in Hashem. It means to have absolute simcha, because whether we like it or not, Torah means that at that time we're not doing something else. If we're learning Torah right now, I don't know what else was on the agenda for today, but the fact is right now we're learning Torah, so you're not doing whatever else was on the agenda. So if, for argument's sake, you have a long shopping list to get through today, fact is, right now you're learning Torah. And you're not doing the shopping. When a person stays after shul, after shachris in the morning, and they learn for an hour or so, they could have been at work. So what is simcha? Simcha is to be absolutely joyous in the now, without the anxiety, without the concern about another alternative that should or potentially could be happening at this time. Now, in our world, we live with so much of the outside world encroaching on us with whatever we're doing, that to achieve the simcha that is required for Torah learning is not so simple. The nice thing about learning in a group is that if anybody's phone beeps in the group, everybody else gives them eyes. But if you're learning on your own, the likelihood is that in the course of half an hour of learning, you'll check your phone at least half a dozen times. So that's a symbol of how much the world encroaches onto our space. Doesn't allow us simcha. What's simcha? Simcha is to say, I'm good with where I am now. I'm happy where I am now. I'm completely in the now. This is the source of joy. Whatever the rest of the world is going to bring for me is going to actually be stress. This is joy. So if a person really wants to learn Torah, they have to be in a position of simcha, not worried about something else. Right now, I'm in the space of bracha. I shouldn't be testing Hashem by watching the clock or worrying about what's going to happen next. I heard a great story once that there was an individual who later became quite a significant Hasidic master. His name was Reb Hershela Ostropola. It means he came from a town called Ostropol. And Reb Hershela Ostropola at the time of this story was a student learning in yeshiva. And in those days, in the shtetl, they didn't have like our kids have today, when they complain about the food in the yeshiva kitchen. There was no yeshiva kitchen. The way that they ate is they had a system called Essen Teg, which means that there was a roster, and every day you ate at a different family. All the bochrim were rotated through the shtetl. Turns out that there was one particular family, you had no choice but to host the bochrim. There was one family that was very tight, very miserly family. And if they ever had bochrim for a Shabbos, they were very worried about how much it would cost to feed this extra mouth at the Shabbos table. So the husband and wife had a little gig where basically they would bring out the food and they'd start interviewing the boy. And while the one is doing the interviewing, the other one was eating. And by the time that one finished eating, the other one started to eat, and they did the interview. And they made sure that the bocher didn't actually get to eat anything because he was so busy talking. They'd clear off the course and bring out the next course, and they had their pre-prepared questions. So Reb Hershel Ostropola hears this story, and he sees he's on the list to get invited to this family. He says, don't worry, I'll sort them out. So it comes that Shabbos, and he's at this family, and they bring out the fish. And straight away, the father says to him, "Nu, where are you from?" He says, "I'm from Ostropol." So the father says, "Oh, you're from Ostropol. Tell me something. Do you know Label the butcher in Ostropol?" He says, "Of course, who doesn't know Label the butcher? Everybody knows Label the butcher." "Nu, how's he doing?" He says, "Gestorben." In Yiddish, that means he's dead. And now the guy gets such a fright, he's shocked. So what are you talking about? I just spoke to him a couple of months ago. I can't believe it, he was in good health. Meantime, he eats the fish. Reb Hershel eats the fish course. The other guy's lost his appetite, the host. Anyhow, he's reeling from shock. They clear off the fish course, they bring out the soup. Says, "Tell me something. What about Nochum the shoemaker? You know Nochum the shoemaker from Ostropolis?" "Of course I know." "Nu, how's Nochum?" "Gestorben." And now the guy is shocked. He doesn't know what to say. In the meantime, Reb Hershel quickly eats the soup. He has a second knedel. He's enjoying himself. They bring out the main course. And now the host is quiet. Scared to say anything. In the meantime, Hershel is eating like a king. And eventually the host says to him, he says, "Tell me something. What about Itcha, the water carrier? How's he doing?" "Gestorben." The guy doesn't know what to do. This is a terrible. He starts to wonder, was there some kind of an epidemic that hit Ostropol that he hasn't heard of? Meantime, this Reb Hershel has had the meal of his life. He got the leftovers that the host didn't eat. They bring out the dessert. And the guy says to him, "I don't understand this. What happened in Ostropol? Was there a pogrom? Was there an epidemic? What happened?" Reb Hershel looks him straight in the eye, and he says, you'll appreciate this if you know Yiddish, says to him, "As ich est, is die ganz Welt gestorben." When I eat, the whole world is dead.
I love it.
That's how we're supposed to learn Torah. When we learn Torah, ganz Welt is gestorben. That's how we're supposed to learn Torah. Nothing exists. Nothing. There's no distraction. There's no worry. There's no time frames. There's no next. Right now I'm learning Torah. That is simcha. Because one of the things that steals simcha from us is living with the concerns of things that we're not dealing with right now, whether that be the anxiety about the future or depression about the past. Simcha is to be absolutely in the experience of Torah learning. And so therefore, when a person learns Torah from a perspective of simcha, that is a gateway to Torah. And that leads us directly to the next thing on the list, which is betahara, with purity. Now it's interesting because immediately the commentaries jump on this and they say, what do you mean betahara with purity? The Gemara tells us very clearly that ein divrei Torah mekablen tuma, that there is no impurity in the world that can contaminate the words of Torah. So therefore, even if a person was in the worst form of impurity, they literally just walked straight out of a cemetery. Person had saras and they quarantined outside of the community. Whatever the impurity is, they learn Torah. They can even get called up to the Torah, because the words of Torah can never be impure. So what does it mean that you learn Torah? But tahara, with purity. What does it mean to learn with purity? So the Medrash Shmuel says, if you have a look, one of the places that we speak about purity is in the design of the menorah. Ha-menorah ha-tahora. That's how it's described. The menorah ha-tahora, the pure menorah. Now, why would the menorah have to be more pure than any other aspect of the Mishkan and the Beis Hamikdash? All of the things that had to be in the Beis Hamikdash obviously had to be pure. So what's unique about the menorah? But it's not talking here about the oil. It's talking about the menorah itself. It's telling us that the menorah itself is a pure menorah. What does it mean pure? What does it mean?
The light of a sheep.
That's not the menorah. That's not the menorah. The actual menorah itself has to be pure. Which means, what kind of a container does it have to be? Pure. What does pure mean? Pure gold. Most people today don't know what pure gold is, because we add other elements to gold in order to help solidify it. And that is what we call impurities. So the menorah had to be made out of pure gold. It couldn't have any other metal added into the mixture to help solidify it. It had to be pure gold, which is a softer metal. So therefore, betahara means that when we learn Torah, it has to be pure in the sense that there are no extraneous elements that come into our Torah learning. So that's a direct follow-on from the simcha, right? When we're learning Torah, that's not a time to be thinking about, hang on a second, what else do I have to do today? Okay, it's almost the end of the shir now, so what is my next appointment? Who am I seeing later today? Oh yeah, I forgot to message this one, or whatever the things are. Purity means to purify our minds, that we don't have extraneous thoughts in our minds, that we can actually learn Torah properly without distraction. Because when we learn Torah properly without distraction, obviously that's when we get to learn the Torah the way that we should. We get the information properly. But there's another layer to this as well. And that is, Torah doesn't just mean to be free of extraneous thoughts. Like, it might be thinking about something that's not related to the Torah. It actually means to be free of other intentions. Going right back to what we said in the first Mishnah of this chapter, that we have to learn Torah for its sake. And so tahara over here means to be pure in the sense that we don't have ulterior motives that are the drive for us learning Torah. Why are we learning Torah? Because we need to be able to give a vort at the Shabbos at the table. I'm not saying you shouldn't. That's obviously a good thing. And not because I need to know practically what to do in this situation, or because I want everybody to recognize the fact that I'm a Torah scholar. So there are varying forms of extraneous thoughts that a person could have. So to learn Torah, but tahara means to learn Torah without any other reason motivating us to learn Torah. We should learn Torah because it is Hashem's Torah. And when we do that, it opens up the opportunity to learn Torah in its infinite form, rather than to lock Torah into our finite limitations. And so that really is a key element to how we should go about learning Torah. So I'm very pleased at that point to say we have now finished what we were supposed to do last time. And please God, next time we can look at the next cluster of traits that a person needs in order to be able to acquire Torah, which are actually techniques, and they're all positive techniques, things that people are supposed to do proactively in order to master Torah.